Consider the dragon. Again. For the first time since the battle had begun, there was a hush. The demons were all dead. The people in the castle looked around at each other, guardedly hopeful. Aurora Rose let out a deep breath. The excitement of the fight, the adrenaline high of survival, was leaving her. She slumped, feeling exhausted. Her dream world was destroyed. The Thorn Castle was no more, torn down to its very elements in the battle against Maleficent. Distances were messed up, things that were far away were too clear and large, as if they had been drawn in wrong. Clothes and beds and golden bric-a-brac littered the ground like an oversized doll's house had been smashed by a giant child. The remaining denizens of the castle looked pitiful and few, now exposed to the mad sky. They pressed against the crumbling remains of the giant thorns that were the only things left to mark the borders of the castle walls. The vines no longer prevented anyone from leaving, but neither did they offer any protection. The raven began to caw. It may have sounded piteous to some, but to Aurora Rose it sounded like fingernails on slate, and it took all her willpower not to crush the bird in its woody cage. "I don't think she's done yet," Liana said unexpectedly. The evil handmaiden had spoken neither excitedly nor disappointedly. She was just making an objective observation. She looked interestedly at where the body of Maleficent lay buried underneath a giant pile of debris. "Obviously, Liana," Aurora said disgustedly, "we're all still here, not awake. She's not dead." Liana looked shocked, maybe even a little hurt by the princess's tone of voice. "You're right, of course. I thought logic didn't work in dreams," she said a little philosophically. "Yes, and you also thought I was a lot sillier than I really am, and—" Then across the silence of the strange world was the tiniest noise of pebbles shifting, of dust sifting down through an unseen blackness. A clink of small rocks being shoved aside, one at a time. A laborious shifting of weight, one rock grinding painfully against another. A single piece of rubble fell off the top of the pile, ominously bouncing and sliding its way down to the ruined and uneven castle floor. Then everything was silent. Aurora Rose turned to say something to Philip, and a hand shot up out of the pile, stabbing its way to the light. A big, clawed, black hand. "No," Philip whispered. As if it was gaining strength from the sheer possibility of release from its stony prison, the creature underneath the rocks began to shift and move. Waves and waterfalls of boulders and rubble tumbled heavily to the floor. Aurora Rose quickly used up what was left of the castle, trying to crush the horrific thing that was slowly emerging. Giant beams, bedrock, furniture, statues, the walls and windows and turrets, the very tower she had jumped from, it all converged on the spot, forced itself into impossibly small spaces, as she imagined crushing the life out of Maleficent. Stones screamed and exploded. Burning liquid scree filled the gaps in the stones, sealing it. There was nothing left. A hot, dusty breeze scoured the desolate plain that had once been a castle. The only things that remained unbroken and upright were the throne, and the strange hovering oval that showed the real sleeping Aurora. Her face was twisted, contorted, her dreams of battle and violence causing her to react in her sleep. But the dreamer made no noise. Everything was silent. And then the castle burst forth. It rose from its cracked stony prison like a lizard from its egg. The thing rose higher and higher into the sky, enormous, nearly as tall as the castle had been, black and purple and yellow. Not like a proper storybook dragon at all. Too skinny here, too lumpy there, wings that were little more than useless flaps on ugly blackened stumps of shoulders, long, narrow, beak-like mouth full of teeth like those of the demons Maleficent had summoned. It screamed, the terrible noise ripping across the empty land. Horrific, like something from the end of the world. It shrieked, and shook rocks off its seemingly endless scaly back and continued to grow into its new skin. "Get out," Aurora said to Philip without moving her eyes from the dragon. "Get everyone out of here." "I'm staying with you. Princes kill dragons, that's what we're all about." "You didn't kill her enough last time. Help me after you get everyone away." Philip opened his mouth to argue, but was interrupted by a shout from behind. "Good subjects of House Stefan!" King Hubert stood on the path that led to the forest, as tall and immovable as a mountain despite the ragged clothing flapping around his ankles. On his legs and arms were fresh wounds, deep ugly gouges, still weeping blood. But his good eye, clouded before, was clear and icy. He clasped his stone as if it were a royal orb, and his stick a mighty staff. "Father," Philip whispered in wonder. You're alive! Come to the shelter of the forest, Hubert ordered. Follow me, and await this battle's end out of harm's way. Now! As if just waiting to be told what to do, the struggling crowd immediately ran to him. He stood aside and gestured them past with his stick like a stern shepherd, and so Aurora Rose's subjects fled into what must have looked like a different kind of death to the dreamland sleepers, the forest that they had been told was dangerous and deadly. The princess felt a surge of warmth and gratitude, something she'd rarely felt for an adult other than her aunts. People could be surprising. Not everyone in the world was untrustworthy and disappointing. Not everyone lied to you or failed you. Quietly pleased, Philip watched his father with a smile. As the last little child ran past him, the king turned, and gave a big old Hubert-style wink. He shook his stone and stick and whispered, "I'll defend them with my very blood." And then he was off behind them, shouting exhortations and marching very precisely. Aurora Rose put her hand to her head. Maleficent's transformation had taken an absurd amount of power, and the blood magic resonated soundly in the princess's body. It was her power the evil fairy stole. She was weak, and not ready for what would come next. The dragon reared up. It belched a wide stream of ugly green fire from its beak. Philip grabbed Aurora Rose and swung her to the other side of him, then stood in front of her. The honor still stood, strangely uncowed by the fire that seemed like it could just have easily consumed her. As the flames neared them, Aurora Rose whipped up a wind that swept the fire aside and into the sky in a vortex of smoke and ash. The dragon shrieked in frustration. But how could she defeat it? What would disable it? What would at the very least trip it up? Gorges. She remembered them from her time in the woods. Steep and narrow. At the bottom were shallow, pebbly streams. The world fell out from below the dragon. The ground caved into itself and tumbled into the bottomless pit that opened up. The giant lizard shrieked and fell backwards, clawing desperately to try to stay upright. Aurora Rose felt a tugging inside her head. "Give up! You cannot defeat me so easily!" The dragon was slithering its way out of the pit, tail and legs moving so quickly and strangely, it was like it was climbing the air itself to get out. Prince Philip ran towards it, sword out. Just at the edge of the pit, he stopped and sliced at the thing's neck, which was now level with the ground. It didn't even scratch a scale. Maleficent threw her head back and laughed, yellow eyes narrowing. That was the only thing, perhaps, that saved Philip from an eye-level blast of hellfire. He ran away, past the dragon, zigzagging over the ruined castle floors, to what had once been the kitchens, the chapel, the treasury. He stopped on the other side of the pit and taunted Maleficent, trying to draw her attention away from Aurora Rose. He clanged his sword against his cuirass and hooted. "Too slow, Maleficent!" The dragon was now entirely out of the pit. It snaked after him, moving and twitching and shuddering like it hurt to stay still. Aurora Rose pushed her hands apart. She imagined opening up the earth like a giant book. The dragon ran headfirst straight into a hill that suddenly rose before it. It staggered, stunned for a moment. But then it rose, shaking its neck and head, and wobbling a bit, and immediately scrabbled over the ground after Philip again. Aurora Rose looked around in desperation. What else could she do? The trees. With a sad twinge, Aurora Rose remembered seeing them for the first time when she escaped the Thorn Castle. How amazed she was that they still existed. Now they pulled themselves out of the ground, with creaking, groaning screams. Branches flew off as an invisible hand stripped their trunks to deadly points. She sent them after Maleficent. The first one slammed the dragon squarely in the back. It swung its head around in annoyance, brushing it off like a twig, and fluttering its useless wings angrily. Aurora Rose threw a dozen more after that, one after another, screaming through the air like large deadly arrows. Maleficent roared, then scampered towards her on ugly flailing legs, doing little to avoid the trees. The wooden tips blunted, the trunks cracked in half, the missiles bounced off the armor of her skin. When they hit, she merely flinched. "Twigs and leaves cannot hurt me, you silly girl!" Philip was chasing after the dragon again, slashing at its tail to get its attention. Maleficent's head whipped around faster than seemed possible, and she belched a river of green fire at him. Aurora Rose screamed. Ugly, hissing black smoke rose where Philip had been. It drifted ghost-like over the piles of rocks and boulders. The dragon threw back its head and roared out laughter like bile. Then it turned with a sudden regal slowness, as if savouring the next bit. Aurora Rose swallowed a sob. She had to not think about Philip. She had to think about the hundreds of people who depended on her, Everyone who needed her to live and win and wake up, so they could live. What kills dragons? Think, Aurora, she said out loud, panicking. What kills dragons? Philip had his magic sword. Aurora Rose imagined a dozen of them. They rained on Maleficent from the crazy sky like metal drops plinking against her skin. The dragon's flesh shuddered, crawling and puckering where each one hit. A few scales the size of war shields fell, but no blood was drawn. No weapons of man can destroy me. I am a mere fairy no more. I am the greatest thing in this world. The dragon's tongue, forked and giant, came out and raked over its lips in expectation. The beast slithered slowly upon Aurora Rose and raised its deadly claw, each nail twice as long as the sword she had summoned and as black as death. And then suddenly, Maleficent's neck snapped back. She screeched in pain, a horrible sound that carried across the world. Standing under her, looking grim, was Lyanna. She had her little bodice knife sunk deep into the flesh of Maleficent's ankle and was twisting it. But weapons from hell can take back what they are owed. There was a very faint but definite smile on her lips. She pulled her dagger out and sank it again, this time in the flat of the dragon's foot. Maleficent roared with rage and spasms, shaking her leg to free herself, but the dagger stayed stuck. She turned to bite Lyanna in half. Suddenly Philip was there, popping up from behind the boulder. Her hair and clothes were singed, and there were burns across his face, but otherwise he seemed unharmed. He cleared the distance between him and Lyanna in seconds. He grabbed her around the waist like she was no more than a ball in a game and kept running. Maleficent whipped her tail like a club. The tip just touched his side, but it was enough to knock him down. He landed with a sickeningly heavy thud, and Lyanna fell out of his grasp. As fast as a cat with a mouse, desperate to escape, the dragon leapt over Philip to pounce on the handmaiden. No! Aurora Rose cried, trying to summon the earth to move, to make a canyon between the two. It was too late. With a look of pure hatred, the dragon ripped its front claws over Lyanna's face and body. Their needle-sharp tips shredded her flesh and opened her innards to the light of day. And then, as if it had merely been an annoying task to be dealt with, the dragon was done. Maleficent spun around and faced Philip and Aurora Rose, not even bothering to gloat over her kill. "Lyanna!" Aurora Rose cried. "Sorry," the old handmaiden wheezed. Then her black eyes froze in place. It was too much. From friend to betrayer to friend and saviour to gone. Aurora Rose couldn't process all of it. Stop, she told herself. Mourn her later. Think now. From somewhere unseen the clock began to strike the hour. Philip and Aurora Rose and even Maleficent paused in confusion. There was nothing left of the castle. Except for the forest, the whole world looked destroyed and grim, flat and featureless in all directions. Yet the distinct bong of a clock could be heard, eerily and perfectly, everywhere at once. Cold dread watched over Aurora Rose. Maleficent reared upon her hind feet, the left one splayed from the dagger. She laughed. "Midnight on the day after your 16th birthday, Aurora. Now you die, and I live again." Aurora Rose thought desperately. What could she do? All this was because of the curse. All of this was because she pricked. Suddenly she knew. She knew what she had to do. Although she had only ever seen one once in the real world, she could bring up a perfect image of it in her memory. The spinning wheel. Bits and pieces of the ruined castle, chairs and tables and beams and other chunks of broken wood began to fly through the air. They spun and interconnected and wiggled until each piece fit, sucking together like lodestones. Aurora Rose frowned, concentrating hard to get the trickier bits in place. They made an ugly, enormous spinning wheel. Maleficent laughed and belched green fire. The spinning wheel caught flame immediately and started to burn away. All but the spindle, the bright black nail with the sharp tip. The dragon looked confused for a moment. Aurora Rose drove the spindle into its heart. The dragon screamed. It spewed fire that changed different hideous colours, bloody red, sickly black, hellfire yellow. Purple and scarlet and black ichor throbbed from the wound and the giant-sized echo of what had happened to Lady Astrid. Aurora Rose watched with a grim, horrible satisfaction. The dragon clawed at its wound, trying to pull the spindle out perhaps, but all it succeeded in doing was ripping out patches of scales and flesh. It toppled, falling so hard the ground shook. The princess was almost thrown off her feet. The dragon writhed and scrambled on the ground as if trying to claw its way back to life. It shuddered and hissed and convulsed. Its wings and scales and tail billowed and fluttered and seemed to shrink, to become raggedy flaps of cloth. These finally shredded and collapsed around what would have been its giant body. Except there was no body anymore either. Just a black and purple and yellow stain on the ground, with little pieces of silk flapping in it like a dying butterfly. The end. And this was when, Aurora was pretty sure, everyone was supposed to wake up. The end? I'm still here, the prince said, rather unnecessarily, Aurora thought. He ran a hand through his thick, dirty mane. Chunks of broken and burned hair came out. At least I hope I'm still asleep. Aurora regarded the pile of filth where Maleficent had died. In the middle of it, like it was the only real thing left, lay the giant spindle, still gleaming and sharp. The Honor lay nearby, broken and torn apart. Her black eyes were open to the apocalyptic sky above. A cold wind blew over the degrading landscape. Aurora took comfort that somewhere beyond the trees her people were safe. They said a royal blood would break the spell, Philip continued. You killed the evil queen. What's going on? She wasn't a real queen. Her voice was strangely flat because of the desolate world, the lack of anything for sound to bounce off. She took a deep breath and winced when it hurt her ribs and chest. Hey, look, Philip said, pointing to the only other distinctive thing among the piles of rubble and rubbish. It was the image of the real Aurora, asleep on her bed. He approached her and tried to walk through like a door, but he pushed through it like it was there and ended up looking at it from behind. For just a moment, sleeping Aurora stirred, and in dream Aurora felt hope rise in her chest. But all sleeping Aurora did was drop an arm over the side of the bed. Her fingers uncurled as she relaxed back into deep sleep. A single crimson drop fell from the tip of her wounded index finger. Royal blood, Aurora murmured. Royal blood. She knew what to do. Aurora squared her shoulders and straightened her helmet. Then she turned back towards the spindle. Don't you dare, Philip said uneasily. Rose? What are you doing? She ignored him. Rose, stop! He leapt up just as she reached the sharp, ugly black thing. But all she did was touch her finger to it. Philip sighed in relief. Aurora stiffened. The pain that ripped through her body wasn't that of a single pinprick. It was as if fire had climbed up through her veins and then out through her ears, through her mouth, through her nose, into the world. She gritted her teeth and tried to ignore it. That was what a queen would do. Cradling her bleeding finger, she walked slowly and carefully to the image of the sleeping princess. She looked at herself, the hollow cheeks, the beautiful hair, the slender neck, the spotless gown. What a mess, she murmured. The little girl, the young woman who could figure out an escape from her fake life and arranged marriage only through death. Who had never known enough to question anything. She took one last look around the bleak, terrible world where she controlled everything. It could be a paradise if she just imagined it. She took another deep breath, reached through the image and held her own hand, touching blood to blood. The last time she had pricked her finger, it was to sleep forever. This time, it was to wake up and live.